Hi, this is the Social Gelo with Angelo show. My name's Angelo. I'm a social scientist, surfer, martial artist, and a whole lot of other things. Coming to you live from Kasai City, Japan, the Social Gelo with Angelo show.
What's up, and welcome to the Social Gelo with Angelo podcast, Conversations with a Back Fist. Today I'm here with Dwight Woods. He's the host and producer, is that correct? Of the Jeet Kun Do Dialogues and the I Love Jeet Kun Do podcast. Before we get started, real quick, you mentioned off camera some of the days, like you have a different day for each one of these podcasts. You want to go through that real quick?
Okay, so Wednesdays at 6 p.m. Miami time, the I Love Jeet Kun Do broadcast, and that's pretty much me talking to the camera on a particular topic. On Fridays, that's the Jeet Kun Do Dialogues, so named because it's me talking with somebody else.
Okay.
So it's two podcasts. So the Wednesday, the I Love Jeet Kun Do broadcast is a little bit more informational and educational, I guess. Right. And then the dialogues is just me, having a conversation, trying to be the Joe Rogan of Jeet Kun Do. That's the Friday. Yeah, that's the Friday podcast,
All right. And then I lost my train of thought. ADD. Okay, so
join the club, man. Join the club.
I think it's a prerequisite to start doing martial arts. You have to have ADD or ADHD. So
it helps.
So also I noticed when I started following you on Facebook, when we became friends on Facebook, because I only heard of for people watching, listening, Dwight Woods was recommended by Mickey Lopez, coming from the Gaylord branch of Kembo. He said, you got to check out this guy. He's doing something similar to what you're doing, and I want you to check out what he's doing. I checked out some of your work, and I actually came across the Jeet Kun Do Dialogues, and I saw a few interviews that you did. I can't remember which ones, but I really liked it. And I said, I got to get this guy on just to talk about it because we're doing similar stuff. Right. And then right off camera, right away, some of the people that I've interviewed, Dwight's interviewed. And it's funny that I always tell people this is not the Kaju Kembo podcast. I'm very, very open because Kaju Kembo's got like an organization and they got this thing called KSDI and stuff. And I'm just a guy who's a black belt who teaches Kaju Kembo and runs a podcast about psychology. In fact, if you listen to my first half of my stuff, there was no martial arts in it. But later, I started interviewing more martial artists, and we were talking about, you called him Stefan. I called him Stefan. I don't know if my ESL, my Puerto Rican ESL might be stepping in right here, and I'm saying Stefan. I'm trying to make it sound as English as possible to hide my accent. So, but Stefan Kesting, I interviewed him as a Kaju Kembo guy because he mentioned it on his podcast and he came on, talked about his Kaju Kembo background. But how do you know Stefan? You said I know him as you were mentioning.
Yeah, I know him. I mean, I know him as both a Jeet Kun Do and a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guy. More so now as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, because I think he's gone, maybe like 98% into the BJJ, and the other stuff is part of his martial art history. But like you just said, your podcast is psychology. So even though everything about my podcast is Jeet Kun Do, Jeet Kun Do, Jeet Kun Do, it doesn't mean that I'll only talk to Jeet Kun Do people. As a matter of fact, we were at lunch today, and I was talking about a good friend of mine, Greg Horton, a mentor of mine, John Graydon, another mentor of mine, Dave Kovar, another mentor of mine, Tom Callis. And those guys are not Jeet Kun Do guys at all, but they have something to offer martial artists on the whole, and they have something to offer Jeet Kun Do people specifically, because some Jeet Kun Do people do not have enough of what I call the success mindset. And these guys do. And these guys are very successful as martial artists. So I'm not going to do the thing where, oh, you're not Jeet Kun Do, I can't talk to you. That's bogus. That's ridiculous. So I've had, but more often than not, it is a Jeet Kun Do colleague of mine who's sharing the microphone with me. Yeah.
All right. And then I guess before we get back to where you are now, so that any guests right now are like, who's this guy? Because at this point, so we're crossing communities, right? So I'm sure you're well known in the Jeet Kun Do community. And also, like I said, Coach Mickey Lopez, who's a Kajikembo instructor and a boxing coach, is the one who recommended your podcast. But now the Kajikembo community who may have not heard who you are, and maybe some of them know Jeet Kun Do people are like, who's this guy? So now to answer the person who's listening to this now with the quizzical look, say, who's this guy? Let's go into your origin story real quick, and then we'll come back.
You know what? I'll tell him this, right? I'll tell him this. So a lot of people will say, oh, Bruce Lee was the first to mix the arts. I raise my hand and I go, not really. Have you ever heard of Kajikembo? Okay, right? So I bring that up to people all the time. So that qualifies me to be on the Kajikembo podcast.
Oh yeah, no, wait. This isn't the Kajikembo podcast. Big disclaimer. I'm going right back to what I said earlier. No. This is not the Kajikembo podcast. A lot of Kajikembo people listen to it. I'm already fighting the idea that some people actually do think it's the Kajikembo podcast.
No, it's well, you know, I mean, Brandon is important, right? And so because of the role that Jeet Kun Do has played in my life, I could call my podcast something else, but I mean, these names just came about, and you know, my online moniker is the Jeet Kun Do Rebel, and it's just because. So quick origin story. I was born in Trinidad. I grew up in Barbados, like a lot of kids who grew up in the end of the 70s and the 80s. I watched a lot of Hong Kong Kung Fu stuff. I was first into the Shaolin stuff, and then Bruce Lee showed up, and that pretty much changed everything. So I started to follow Bruce Lee as much as you could in the 70s with no internet or what have you, right? So then, you know, as I got older and I could get magazines and books and whatever, and then in 1980, I was furloughed by my job. I moved to Seattle for 3 months because that's where Bruce Lee was buried. 1981, July 20th, the anniversary of his death, I went to pay my respects in Seattle. 82, went to pay my respects in Seattle. 83, I said to myself, Dwight, you will get no further in Jeet Kun Do if you keep paying your respects to the deceased source. You got to find a living source. That living source pointed me to Dan Inosanto, Bruce Lee's premier disciple. So I went to see him in July of 1983, and I've been with him since then.
Okay, and then we're gonna back up, because actually, I don't know if you've checked out my show before. What I normally do, and I did it backwards because I don't have a format. Normally, I start with a story of who you are, and then we talk about where you are now. But I've been I've been enjoying doing the Tarantino style lately, where we're like and what did that? Okay, let's make this make sense later. So like,
but you know, in some Jeet Kun Do circles, you can't mention that name Tarantino. They're pissed at him, man.
Oh yeah, I heard that. Well, okay. So before we get too more distracted, maybe we should call this the ADHD podcast. so going back to 1980, obviously something happened where you wanted to start actually studying martial arts, because a lot of people will watch Bruce Lee or watch a kung fu movie and be like, that's cool, I like martial arts movies, and then just go on with their lives and never do any martial arts. So what was the first martial art, or what kind of training, how old were you, and what kind of training did you start doing at first?
Well, we'll never talk about how old I am.
Okay, not now, at the time. At the time, right? And you don't have to put 19. Don't say 1980, 1970. Just say how old you were.
So I'm pretty sure that it was Kung Fu Films that first lit the fire. And so literally I'd be in the movies with a notebook from school, making notes of what they were doing on screen so that I could go home and practice that stuff. And then, we got the Bruce Tegner books on Kung Fu and karate and Tai Chi. And I mean, any martial art book that I could get my hands on. And I would just, I would practice stuff out of those books. And I mean, that has continued to this day, right? So that's how it started. I joined a local school, but that didn't do too well because I kept talking about Bruce Lee. Because at my house, I had made a punching bag, I had made a stretch pulley, I had made a Wing Chun dummy, and at this school, we just would kick and punch the air. So every time I went to class, it'd be like, but Bruce Lee said this and Bruce Lee said that. And they were like, Dwight, you are not Bruce Lee and we can't take it anymore. And so they kind of asked me to leave.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
What style was that, if you don't mind me asking?
It was.
You don't have to say the school for some reason. Just what style?
It was actually, if I remember correctly, it was a system that a guy from Barbados, when he went to uni in London, he studied it up there, got his black belt, and brought it back to Barbados. So it was a kind of a compilation of Chinese systems. In fact, I remember once I saw somebody doing a form from, I forget what system of Kung Fu, and I recognized it as something that I had practiced. So I think this guy in England had legitimate training in something, and he just put it together, gave it the name Wushu Quan, and okay. Then so it still exists in England, and probably still in Barbados as well. Okay. I wouldn't be surprised.
So yeah. It's just a style of wushu. And then for those people that don't know what wushu is just a general term for Chinese martial arts.
Exactly.
Martial arts, so
right. Yeah. And Quan is like school, right? Yeah. So it's school of general Chinese martial arts. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
All right. So you did a little bit of wushu till they got fed up with you and kicked you out. And then what happened after that?
So then I used to hang out at the Shotokan place. I never joined, but I would be there because I needed to be surrounded by other martial artists, right? So I had some associates who trained in the Shotokan place. So I would go down there and I would just watch them. I would watch class and I would talk with my friends and what have you. On Sundays, we would meet before class started. And we would spar down in the bathrooms, right? So I spent a lot of time with Shotokan because I was into martial art per se. Yes, Bruce Lee and Jeet Kun Do, those were the driving forces. But anything related to martial art, I was interested in. So I had Karate Do Kyohan, I think, by Funakoshi. I had Mastering Karate by Oyama. I had Karate Beyond Empty Hand by Inoda. Now I can't remember the names, right? But so I collected everything I could get my hands on martial art. Didn't matter what it was. I was interested in it. And so at one point, my backyard in Barbados was kind of the meeting place for anybody who had the idea or the thought to go beyond their style.
And then just to pause you real quick, the book you mentioned, was that the one by Hidetaka Nishiyama? Karate, the Art of Empty Hand. Does that sound familiar?
No, I'm pretty sure it's Igami.
Oh, it's Igami. Okay.
Yeah, Karate Beyond Empty Hand. I think.
Oh, Beyond
Empty Hand. Yeah.
Okay, beyond. Let me make sure in case any karate nerds are listening.
I know, right?
that's what I'm always.
I
Karate
would hate to mess it up.
Yeah, karate beyond the empty hand, and yeah, I'm not finding it. It's okay. The karate nerds can just
Yeah.
deal with it.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
continue.
yeah. So I mean, because Bruce Lee, we could say would compare and contrast the classical approach versus his approach, and so I wanted to have that understanding of the classical approach as well, right? So, I mean, at one point when I was in Wushu Quan, I could do all the forms up to red belt, second red belt or something. And the belts went ungraded white, first blue, second blue, first red, second red, I think, something like that. I could do all the forms up to second red as an ungraded white belt. I could do up to Heian Sandan in Shotokan, right? Because I was a nerd and or a fanatic, one of the two, all right? And while I'm doing all of that, I'm still going to the movies because in Barbados, we had there were 3 cinemas that showed double features of Kung Fu films every week. So we had 6 films to watch every week. I tried to watch all of them, right? So I'm watching Kung Fu films, I'm making notes, I'm training Wushu Quan, I'm hanging out with the Shotokan guys, anything that I could get my hands on. That's what I spent my time doing. So essentially, I was training myself in Jeet Kun Do, but then in '83, I met Inasano, and literally my first 2 minutes with him, I had this rush of a feeling and it was like, oh, okay, now it all makes sense. Because you have that experience where it's like you find the thing or even the person that you've been looking for. You know what I mean? And the thing about it is that based on everything I had read, Dan Inosanto was Bruce Lee's Jeet Kun Do guy. The camp that I signed up for, he was not on the roster as teaching Jeet Kun Do. He was actually teaching Filipino Kali. But that didn't matter to me. I went for the guy. I didn't go, I didn't have the good sense or the foresight to limit myself to Bruce Lee's Jeet Kun Do, right? Instead, I went to the guy that I knew had spent a ton of quality time with Bruce Lee. You see? So because I was on a search, I wasn't looking for somebody to hand me Jeet Kun Do on a platter. So I went to spend a week with Inosanto because he was the guy, and a week with Francis Fong in Wing Chun because I knew that Bruce Lee had studied Wing Chun. So my intention, Angelo, was to hang out with them, go back to Barbados, and put stuff together and make sense of it for myself and share it with the guy with the guys back home. I fell in love with the art. And so I maneuvered, like immediately when I got back home, I maneuvered days off to get back out to California for another week. And then fortunately for me, I was working in the airline industry. So I spent 8 years following Dan Inosanto all over the United States as much as I could. In '91, the airline collapsed. And so I didn't have travel privileges, but I would still go out and see him as much as I could. Then in 89, we started bringing him to Miami, and we brought him to Miami every summer. In fact, I used to bring him as close to June 2nd, which is my birthday. I'd bring him to Miami as my birthday gift to myself. We did that from 89 to 2006, right? So that's it. That's the life.
And then somewhere along the point in your story, you had your own kind of martial arts club.
Yeah.
Fight club. But we don't talk about that.
Right.
That's the first rule, right?
That's the first rule.
So, yeah. But when did you start? Obviously, you were always kind of sharing knowledge, but when did you start kind of working with a group where it was no longer really sharing knowledge, but mostly you kind of leading a group, teaching them? When did that happen? How did that mentally work for you? And the reason I'm asking this question is because a lot of the guests I've had, including myself, there's always this transition where you get into martial arts for whatever reason you got into it. You're doing a lot of studying, a lot of research, a lot of practice, trading knowledge with other people. But at one point you start realizing people start asking you to teach them stuff. And then you end up in the situation where you're now like teaching a small group or whatever. When did that kind of happen to you? And how did you kind of make that transition from just keeping it all to yourself and then kind of taking on students?
Well, the thing is, so Inosano was quite impressed that I had flown out to California from a tiny Caribbean island. And he said, Dwight, the best way to really learn this stuff is to try to teach it to somebody else. Now, that didn't mean that he made me an instructor after 2 weeks. He just said, if you try to show it to somebody else, it'll help you to cement it. So you could say I had permission from week number 2 to show people stuff, because technically back in those days, as kind of like the rules in the Inosano clan, you weren't supposed to do that stuff. You weren't supposed to share it except with like family or what have you. So he said, so yeah, when you get back, try to explain it to the guys and whatever. So I had that permission. So as I started traveling back and forth, I always had license to share with others. In 1985, I was formally inducted into his instructorship program. So I became an apprentice instructor in 85. So now it's kind of semi-official. You see, you've been around for 2 years. You've shown that you're dedicated to the art, because we see you in LA so much, we think you live in LA, right? So, I mean, I got my instructorship in Lansing, Michigan, right? Okay, right? I was in Lansing, Michigan in like September, October 1985. That's where I was made an instructor. So with that, now you're not supposed to open up a school or whatever. And so I moved to Miami in 86. So I had a group that we'd meet in the park or what have you. In 88, so now I had 5 years with Inosano. In 88, we decided to put a roof over our head. And so we started, we got a warehouse, and we put up some heavy bags and what have you. I made sure to get a warehouse that looked as close as possible to the Inosano warehouse, to the Inosano Academy, right? As a matter of fact, many years later, this was probably about a year or 2 years ago, on Facebook, I put up a picture of that 1989 seminar, that first seminar of Inosano in Miami. And there were people who trained at the Inosano Academy who thought that it was a picture of the Inosano Academy. That's how ridiculous it was. Right? So yeah, so then for about 3 years, I had the warehouse and I still had a full-time job. Actually, no, in 89, some people went on strike. So they sent us home for a few months. And when they sent us home, I upgraded the schedule at the warehouse to full time because I didn't have anything else to do. So then when they called us back, so they sent us home, let's say they sent us home in January of '89. They called me back to work in April, but not to work in departure services, to work on the ramp. And I declined because I was having so much fun being a full-time martial artist. But when they called in September of '89, I needed the money. So I went back to work, but it was part-time. So I was able to keep a full-time schedule at the warehouse and work part-time in the airlines. So in '91, when the airline collapsed, I just seamlessly segued into full-time martial art. You know, I actually did go interview at another airline. And I realized that after more than 10 years, I was going to have to start at the bottom with these new people. And I did something that was uncharacteristic for somebody like me at that point in my life, which was to strike out on your own. Because I come from a culture where entrepreneurship is not necessarily the thing that is emphasized. It's go to school, go to uni, get a degree, and get a job. You know, and I come from a culture where it's dependent on I think you could almost say dependent on your parents' upbringing. It's lawyer, doctor, right? But not even engineer so much in the islands. Lawyer or doctor or teacher, right? Not airline employee, right? And certainly not martial arts instructor. That doesn't make any sense. So it was uncharacteristic for somebody like me to forego the security of a biweekly paycheck because you're working for somebody else. And I just struck out on my own, and I've been doing that for, what are we now, 31 years, been on my own.
That's funny. So like my parents, I was born and raised in California, but my parents were both Puerto Rican, as I mentioned. I kind of seen it earlier. So in my family, my father was a mechanic. So his ideas were, if you do go to school, you don't study anything that society doesn't immediately need. And there's a big if here. If you do go to school. There's a big if. He was always like, finish high school, go to work. That was pretty much his thing. You don't need a degree to become a mechanic. You become a mechanic by getting licensing, ASC certified, and you can be a mechanic. And it was kind of the opposite. It's funny that you mentioned, like, for your family, entrepreneurship wasn't encouraged. In my family, it was. It was like, you become a mechanic and you work for yourself.
Yes.
And my dad went through the whole company stuff, and he always hated his bosses. So he's like, he worked for himself, and he told me, you're gonna do the same thing. You be a mechanic though. You don't work for yourself in some foo-foo job, like some art. Art is not a art is. I remember his face when I told him I decided to go to school, and I'm studying art. He's like, what? Why? I'm like, well, it's a requirement. Why is it required? Nobody needs art. So yeah. So like there's like, it's just a mentality of making money, right? Like the idea that you want something solid to take care of your family. So like, yeah, it was always mechanical engineer. That was okay. Becoming a teacher was okay, but be careful because it doesn't pay enough. Lawyer also, lawyer, doctor, but doctor takes forever and costs a lot of money, and no one's going to pay for that. And get ready, because I'm not going to pay for it, was his thing. So like, but very similar mentality. Just a little bit opposite as far as the entrepreneurship. So the islands really encourage you to have something solid, right? And money is.
Yeah, I mean, you know, remember we didn't break away from England. You know, in fact, let's see. Barbados was always a British colony. It was never Spanish, then French, then British. It was British from like day one for 300 and something years, and then in 1966 became independent, but just at the end of last year became a republic. So they're no longer part of the British Commonwealth. They're now a republic. So the Queen is no longer recognized as the head of state. You know, so if I'd been born later, maybe the idea of breaking away, right, would have been infused somewhat earlier. I don't know.
Wow. So you opened your house, and I just want to go on a quick note here because I found it kind of interesting. You said that in JKD, you're not supposed to open up a school. Like, can you unpack that real quick? What's that look like?
Okay, so there are 4 ranks of instructorship: apprentice, associate, full, and then senior full. So as an apprentice instructor, technically, you're not supposed to be running a school, like making a living as such as an instructor. So you're supposed to spend 5 years as an apprentice. If I remember all this correctly, it could be different from the way it was back then. But at associate level, yes, now you can open a school, start running classes or whatever. But as an apprentice for 5 years, it's supposed to be a kind of a like maybe even a backyard thing, you know, because the backyard is kind of well, it does play a historical role in the development of Jeet Kun Do in the United States, because Bruce Lee, when he started in Seattle, they didn't have a place immediately. So they trained in the park, they trained in parking garages and what have you, until then they got a roof over their head. In Seattle, and then when he left Seattle and he went to Oakland, the school was in James Lee's garage, right? In Los Angeles, they first trained behind a pharmacy of one of Bruce Lee's students before, and then I think there was training that was conducted in the living room at an apartment, but then they got a place. And then when Bruce Lee left in 1970 and went to Hong Kong to do the movies, he told Inosanto to close the place and take the most dedicated people to his backyard. So we're back to the backyard thing. So a lot of people in JKD have that informal setting where they train in a garage, in the backyard, in the park or whatever, rather than having this 4-walled encasement where, you know, it's a business, right? A lot of people don't think that Jeet Kun Do can be a business. And so they frown on those who make a living, because is it like that in Kaju Kembo?
So that's why it's not. That's why. So like, well, it is and it's not. See, the thing about Kaju Kembo is when you look at the origin of Seijo Imperato and you read John Bishop's book Kaju Kembo, he goes a little bit into the history. There's other books out there, and if I didn't mention your book, I'm really sorry. There's another book that you can read called Black Robe, but that goes more into the brothers founders. But the founder of Kaju Kembo, very similarly in Hawaii, was he came from a boxing background, but the history of it, I hear a lot of convoluted stories. Some saying that he used to be a pro boxer, some saying that he was. So let's just go off of what I've heard and just take it for surface value. It may or may not be completely accurate. But he came from a boxing background. and was looking for something that would be effective in the streets of Hawaii where people were being harassed. And they would go into, he got together with some people that were from different backgrounds, karate, military, and they were training at empty barracks. Here's my ESL again. Those military buildings.
Yes, barracks.
Barracks. All right,
Barracks, yeah.
good. I said it right the first time.
Yes.
Yeah, they were training around empty barracks, going over concepts. He was reading karate books, and he did a little bit of formal karate, but he still wanted something that was more for street fighting.
Yeah.
Right. So it started off a group of guys. Sound familiar? A group of guys training in parks, and in empty parking lots, in empty barracks,
yes.
and then going and testing it out by essentially not starting fights, but going to places where their new fights were going to happen. There was a street, I forgot, I think it was Main Street or something. Hackleman talks about this, but there was a part of Hawaii where all the sailors would go get drunk and fight. So they would go there on purpose, knowing that they'd be picked on for being locals, and then they'd fight the sailors to test it out. So that's how the art started. And then they went to a community center called the Palama. It was in the Palama settlement, and there was a community center there that they started officially forming the art itself at a community center. But they never made any rules about you have to teach it at a community center, you got to open a dojo, you got to teach it at the park. It's just you do whatever you want. There are no rules. There was just, teach it. Once that's what they said is similar to what Inosanta told you. There's always a point where the instructor will turn around to a student that's coming up and be like, well, the best way to really figure this out is to teach us something else. But we don't have any rules about it. So I think it's interesting that you say like the community kind of frowns upon people who open a big gym. I would say one thing that's similar. Mm-hmm. The Kajukenbo community does frown upon Kajukenbo instructors who seem to be greedy. So if it looks like they're being kind of like a franchise, and it's all about the money for them,
right?
We won't talk badly about them, but we definitely don't like it. Because I posed a question about this because I like to cross train, and I was training at a unsaid franchise Brazilian jiu-jitsu gym that's internationally known. And if you're a martial artist, you probably know who I'm talking about, but I'm not going to say who they are because I still train with them in Japan. But I had the situation where after class, I asked the instructor, because I'm running my program, I'm an ESL teacher, I got a bunch of businesses, I'm busy. Mm-hmm. So I don't have time to go to this place every night. I go there twice a week during the day. And I asked him at the end of one of the classes, hey, one of the weeks class was over. He showed me some stuff because at that point I've been there long enough to be a blue belt. I got a blue belt. And he showed me, he said, I noticed nobody's here today. How about today we go over the blue belt curriculum? Because you're always going over white belt curriculum. You never go over the advanced stuff. I'm like, all right, cool. Let's do that. And we did that. And then the next week after class, there was only like one student there that day. It was like one or two students. And I noticed that after class, we have this thing called, we had free mat time about an hour.
Right.
And he would go sit at his desk and do paperwork. But he normally, if someone asks him to do stuff like spar or whatever, he'd spar with them. So I asked him, hey, after class, when the class was over, I said, hey, can you show me, because one of the other students walked up to me, he's like, hey, I don't want to work with he was also a blue belt. I don't want to work this white belt stuff. I want to do some blue belt stuff. And I said, well, I try to avoid bringing in my Kajukenbo curriculum to another place I don't train at. Like I try to keep that separate. Yeah. So I really didn't want to do it. So out of laziness on my part, I went up to the instructor and said, hey, can you maybe show us a drill or a technique from the blue belt class that I can go over, and then we can go over with some of the blue belts. And he turned to me and said, well, if you want to do that, you have to pay me for a private lesson. And I was like, all right, that's cool. That's all right. I understand. That's where we're at. And this is definitely not Kajukenbo, and that's cool. I didn't say that, but in my head, I'm running. This is definitely not Kajukenbo, and obviously you have a business to run. That's cool. I respect that. I was kind of bitter about it, but I didn't say anything to him. But I posed that question to the Kajukenbo community, and the overwhelming response was they were all pissed off. It's like, that's how, if you were wondering, like, where we don't have rules, but do we get mad about certain things? That kind of situation for a Kajukenbo guy just seems foreign, because once we get our money, and even then, it's not about the money. It's never about the money. It's always about the training. So there's always, it's very, at a Kajukenbo school, you'll always find a student who probably can't afford to pay tuition and is most likely training for free. You'll also find a lot of Kajukenbo groups where everyone's, some people are voluntarily just giving some money to the guy, but the guy's not even charging. That happens, and we don't care. But if someone wants to charge, that's fine too. But if someone starts doing what I just, like, with that little situation there, that makes us all feel kind of like, I guess that's to answer your question.
Yeah. There are people in the JKD world who believe, one, if you open up a school and it's a successfully run school, like you can pay your rent and pay employees and pay yourself, then you must automatically be selling out and watering it down. There are people who think that, right? I have tried to explain to them from time to time, if you look at the founder of Jeet Kun Do, you will see that he was not afraid at all of making money through his art. Not at all. He's been gone since 1973. I still cannot charge as much for a private lesson as he did back in the late 1960s. I still can't. Bruce Lee was charging with the equivalent of $1,300 an hour. Yeah.
But then again, right? Like in some of the stories, like when I interviewed Daniele Bolelli, and Daniele Bolelli, have you heard of Daniele Bolelli before?
I know the name, yes, for sure.
Oh, okay, right. So he worked a lot. He got permission from Shannon and got access to the notes that Bruce Lee left behind. And he's a historian. So he put together a great podcast. It's for free. Check it out. Daniele Bolelli, Bruce Lee. And he really does a great job grabbing all the notes and kind of chronologically putting out Bruce Lee's life in a podcast series. And one of the things he mentioned in there was that when Bruce Lee moved to California, like going to Hollywood, the whole idea of going to Hollywood, right, was to kind of financially stabilize himself, whether it was through martial arts or whether it was through Hollywood movies. From an outsider perspective, it seemed to be one and the same. Like, he was really struggling. Like things in his life were not easy. They were living at someone's house, another martial artist's house, right? And they were that was Oakland. Yeah, in Oakland, right? And then
in Oakland, they lived at James Lee's house.
Yeah, and then eventually, the whole Hollywood path is what got him to kind of financially stabilize himself.
Yeah, that was the beginning of it. When he got the gig as Kato, then that was the start of Hollywood success, right? Yeah. Unfortunately, it lasted one season, and that was it. So then after that, I am nowhere near the historian that Danielle is. So after that, it was kind of odd jobbing around Hollywood, stunt coordinator stuff, guest appearances, private lesson stuff to Sterling Silliphant, to Joe Hyams, to Polanski, those kinds of people.
So to kind of, and to not go, and again, for my listeners, you want to get some more Bruce Lee history, Google Daniele Bolelli.
Yeah.
Type in Bruce Lee. There's like 4 hours. It's like 4 or 5 hours. It's a long, very detailed, JKD approved, because it was through Shannon. So
I'm on it as soon as we're done.
Yeah, check it out. It'll go through all these details that I personally, I can listen to that thing 100 times and I still get information from it. So my question to you then, going back to our and we're getting to the end of the podcast, and I love to have these conversations towards the end, because now people know who you are, right? We said in the beginning, we were saying some stuff and people were like, who is this guy? Well, now we know who he is.
Right.
at this point, we know who he is. So what do you think about that? Going into, there was a few controversial stuff. We'll get to that in a bit. But on this topic of charging for your martial art and this topic of business in a martial art, how, you said in the JKD community it's kind of frowned upon. How do you see it? How do you see the idea of trying to make money from your martial art?
Well, my role model for professional success in martial art is Bruce Lee. If you Google, probably still to this day, if you Google the concept of definite chief aim, you will find Bruce Lee's handwritten note to himself. The one that says, I, Bruce Lee, will be the highest paid Oriental actor, right? Then he details, starting in 1970 and for 10 years on, I will earn this amount of money and what have you. He talks about how what he will give in order to earn that money. So he actually followed the formula for the proper construction of what some people call definite chief aim, or what its origins is in Napoleon Hill's Secrets of Success, the 17 laws of yeah, there you go.
Yeah. When I first Googled it, it took me a minute because the first thing that did come up was, like you just mentioned, was Napoleon.
Yeah.
Napoleon.
Yeah. So right. So
Napoleon Hill. Yeah.
Right. So in Think and Grow Rich, it's in the principle called definiteness of purpose, but it's kind of its colloquial term is definite chief aim, and a lot of it because of how Bruce Lee wrote it. So if Bruce Lee, the founder of Jeet Kun Do, had no problem being a commercial success, why should I struggle over that? I follow him in almost everything else. So why all of a sudden should be, oh, well, it's okay for Bruce Lee to make money off of it, but it's not okay for me to make money off of it, simply because there's somebody out there who thinks, oh, well, yeah, if you do that, then you're a sellout. Well, whatever. Right? I mean, come on. You know, we look, as martial artists, we spend, you talked about med school and the amount of money that you spend in med school and whatever. Do you think that I followed Inasano around for years for free? Yeah, I had an airline job, yes. So maybe I didn't have to pay full fare for flights and what have you, but it costs money to, and then after the job, I still followed him around. So I was paying full fare, right? So it's meals, it's flights, it's transportation, it's accommodation. Come on. So you spend a ton of money to develop your knowledge and your skill. Why should you not then be compensated for that? It works that way in every other industry. Everybody invests in their education, and then when they set up shop, they get less reimbursed, so to speak. You charge, right, a reasonable fee, let's call it. So what's the big deal if you do that in martial art? You just do it with integrity. You know what I mean? You don't become a sellout. You don't go, you don't, my friend, my colleague, Levon Martin talks about this. You don't nickel and dime people. You know what I mean? So it's like, if somehow you ended up staying at the school an hour later than than you usually do, oh, well, you got to pay overtime charges or
yeah, you got to pay me. You got to pay me for a private lesson.
Yeah, right. I mean, stuff like that. I mean, like, how long does it take to show two blue belts something to work on?
Yeah, exactly. Like,
right. I go,
5 minutes.
Right. So okay. So I want you to do this, and then and then you do this, and then here's one counter to the technique. See ya. Go back and do the paperwork.
Yeah, I
You
didn't.
know,
Yeah. All right. I hate to cut this short, everyone. I'm still here with Dwight, and me and Dwight are about to continue to talk about a great subject. What is success in martial arts? Please check out part 2 of this series. I think you'll really enjoy it. And I'll catch you all next time. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe on YouTube. And thanks for watching.